Hi, this is Mrs. Solomon, and we are getting ready to finish up the primeval story by going through Genesis 9, verse 18 through Genesis 11, verse 32. If you have not read this section of the primeval history, please stop the recording and do that now so that you can get an idea of the flow of the story. Contained within this section is the Table of Nations, the Tower of Babel, and the end of the primeval story. But before we can get to the Table of Nations, let's finish up the story of Noah. As you can see, there is an introduction of the sons of Noah, who were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Notice the relationship that is noted here, that Ham was the father of Canaan, and this familial relationship is going to be important to understanding the purpose of this story. So as you have the three sons, here is Noah back from the flood, and he has just entered into covenant with God for all of creation. Notice that it says that he got drunk. He was a man of the soil and he planted a vineyard. So he got drunk. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. He got drunk and it looks like he got hot, and so he took off his clothes. Here is the problem though. Verse 22 says, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. The problem with this action is that, remember in the Garden of Eden, when the man and the woman first came together, it said they were naked and not ashamed. But with the transgression of Adam and Eve eating the fruit, once they did it, they realized that they were naked and they were ashamed. So now what is associated with nakedness is shame. Ham, by seeing the nakedness of his fathers and telling his two brothers outside, dishonors his father. He exposed his nakedness and he shamed him. And according to the HarperCollins Study Bible note, it says, for a son to see his father drunk and naked and to leave him in that state is disrespectful. So that is the essence of the sin that goes on here. When Shem and Japheth find out, they laid a garment on him without looking at his nakedness. They turned away. So it appears as though through Ham's action that sin continues even after recreation. So here are the consequences. Noah wakes up and knows some kind of way that Ham dishonored him. But instead of cursing Ham, he curses Canaan, Ham's son, and indicates that Canaan will be the lowest of slaves to his brothers. And then he blesses the other brothers, his other sons. So why is it that Canaan is cursed and not Ham? It appears that this story serves the purpose of describing why in the patriarchal story and thereafter that the Canaanites are not, or are despised by the ancestors of the Israelites. And in fact, as we'll go through the text, we'll see that the Canaanites are the peoples who live in the land that God says that the Israelites are supposed to conquer. So evidently this story is to lend credence to the despising of the Canaanites in the biblical story. So that is the purpose for this story in Genesis chapter 9, the story of Noah getting drunk and Ham uncovering his nakedness. So as we move along in the primeval story, in Genesis chapter 10 appears to be, or not appears to be, but is a genealogy that is often referred to by scholars as the Table of Nations. And basically what you have here is the disbursement of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the locations and the peoples that are contained in the locations in the known world, specifically in the ancient Near East and heading eastward toward Europe. As you can see here, Shem is the ancestor of the Semites. Ham is the ancestor of those who, the Canaanites and those peoples of northern Africa. And then Japheth is thought to be the ancestor of the Europeans. And what this Table of Nations, or what this genealogy demonstrates, is that God has blessed humanity even after the flood. Yes, sin continues to increase in the world, but God expected it. But God still continues to bless. Remember that it said in Genesis chapter 1 to be fruitful and multiply. Here is a geographical representation of the Table of Nations. As you can see, Japheth is located upward, northwestward, Asia Minor going on towards Europe. Shem, as you can see, his ancestor, him being the ancestor of those who live in the ancient Near East, Middle East area, and then Ham's ancestors, as you can see, in the area of Africa, Egypt, and around that area. So, as we move along in Genesis chapter 10, in the Table of Nation, I just want to point you to verses 8 through 10, where Cush became the father of Nimrod. Nimrod is described as a mighty warrior, a mighty hunter before the Lord. That mighty hunter before the Lord is more like a superlative. So it is translated better by saying the mightiest hunter in the world at that time. Notice at the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. So when we get to chapter 11, notice that the whole earth had one language and the same words. And the people came upon a plain in the land of Shinar. Shinar is the area of Babylonia. And before you continue to read, I want to point you to the HarperCollins study notes for chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. And as I page there, please make sure you read that. It talks about how this is the Tower of Babel story. It is the last tale in the primeval narratives of human hubris and its consequences, and also serves to mock the pretensions of the contemporary imperial power of Mesopotamia. So continue reading that note so that you can get a better feel for what this story is about. Notice it says that the people said that they wanted to build themselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. This tower is known as a ziggurat, which is a rectangular stepped tower, and at the top of the tower are often temples that are dedicated to the worship of local gods. We see these ziggurats in Mesopotamia mostly, although they did build versions of them in Egypt. But here it says they desire to make a name for themselves, that they desire to build this tower with its top in the heaven. So their desire is to breach the boundary between the divine and the human, to make a name for themselves. And as we know, God has set that boundary not to be breached. Here is an example of a ziggurat. As you can see, it's sort of rectangular shaped, stairs going up toward the top. And typically at the top of that ziggurat would be a temple that is dedicated to a local god, and people would go up to those temples and worship that God. But God does not like what they do, and he came down to see the tower. Basically, as you can see here, he says in verse 7, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." And so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. And therefore, in verse 9, it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. So here, what this is, it's an etiology. It describes how there became different languages in the earth, and describes how peoples were scattered over the earth. And I want to point you to verse 9. There is a word play here. If you take a look in your HarperCollins Study Bible, it says, "Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the earth." If you notice that there is a footnote after the Lord confused, that word confused in the Hebrew is Balal, and the city is Babel. So the sound of the words there are very similar, and Babel being the place where the confusion started. So I just wanted to let you know there that you do have a wordplay that doesn't necessarily appear in the English language. So here you have an etiological story. Moving along then in the rest of chapter 11, in verse 10, these are the descendants of Shem. And that's a Toldot. So here you've got the story of Shem, one of Noah's sons. And I want to just briefly tell you here that you've got the introduction now of a family of people. And one of those people in this family is Abram. So now this universal focus that we have had in the primeval story, focusing on the entire world, now narrows to a more specific people. And these are the people of Abram's line. So here you have the introduction to Abram, who is the first patriarch. And not only do you have the introduction to Abram, but also his wife, Sarai, who, as you can see in verse 30, was barren. And notice that they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans, Abram and his family. Ur of the Chaldeans, remember, is in the land of Mesopotamia, and it says to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. And here ends the primeval story with the introduction of a specific people. So, questions again, and this is the same question that I had in the last screencast. What does this entire narrative from chapter 9, from Noah getting drunk and Canaan being cursed, to the introduction of Abram's people, what does this entire section and this entire narrative tell us about the human condition? And what can you tell us about the nature of God from this section? Well, that concludes the primeval story. I'll see you in class, and we will discuss more.